you're all comfy and not in the rain. We have another talk tonight. This one will be, as
30 minutes.
will not be excessive in temporal dimensions because we have an expert amongst us on the politics of time. That's one of his early books. Peter Osborne, whom I'm welcoming here, is a philosopher coming from London and who has worked on the philosophy of time after Marx, but also on critical theory, and especially has been working on political theory and aesthetics. And he is one of the pioneers of a philosophy of art that is trying to bring out the categories or the criteria of contemporary art as in distinction to modern art. So he's one of those who have tried to come up with a coherent theory explaining the difference between modern art as conceptual in difference to contemporary art being post-conceptual. You can ask him, the author of the post-conceptual condition, what it means and what the categories are. I have read some of it, and I'm happy to maybe engage with you in a discussion what the relevance of contemporary art can be for politics and for renovation of the thought of democracy. Today he promised to address also the question of artistic collectives in a way.
Collectives and art.
Collectives and art, and I'm very curious to know what you think about it. So please welcome Peter Osborne.
Yeah. Thank you. This is quite loud. Yeah, shall I? It's good? Yeah, it's a bit scary. Okay, I'm very pleased to be in this strange space. Okay, I begin with an epigram from Paul Ricoeur from his book Memory, History and Forgetting, 2004, in which he sort of states the obvious, but it's my starting point, so I'm going to let him state the obvious and then carry on. And the quote goes like this: "The full and precise formulation of the concept of modernity is achieved only when one writes and says our, inverted commas, our modernity at the level of the concept of history itself." And he goes on to say, this is the standpoint of Hegel's I that is we and we that is I, this famous phrase of Hegel's you may know. However, he says, once this claim is laid bare, so too is its impossibility. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that modernity as a world historical political concept, which is the way in which it still functions for a lot of people, is uninhabitable. Its enunciation is unfulfillable because it has no possible subject of utterance. So I'm assuming that to be the case. So the question is, if that is the case, that is to say, if the Enlightenment concept of politics as a world historical process has no possible subject, where does this leave the problem of political collectivity? The problem of what in a kind of Beuysian manner, I'm going to make my one affirmative Beuysian reference early on. The problem of, which in the Beuysian manner I'm calling the problem of the expanding we, or the problem of how to expand the we without negating the I. Okay, that's what I take to be the problem of political collectivity, which is the problem of political subjectivity once it's dissociated from some world historical unity. And secondly, what, if any, role does art have to play here beyond Beuys's problematic identification of art as social sculpture with a conception of society as a social organism? I take Beuys's identification to be problematic because it contains an authoritarian slippage from the utopian democratic idea of art, everyone is an artist, to the artist as a stand-in for everybody, and that's the slippage in Beuys from radical democracy to prophetic authoritarianism. with its shades of Stalin's direct politicization of Wagner's concept of the total work of art. That's to say, society becomes the total work of art. So essentially, Boris Groys's interpretation of Stalin as a total work of art, I think, is homologous with the Beuys project, so I'm not going there. What role does art have to play beyond its this is another thing I take Beuys to be slightly responsible for. Beyond its reduction to the expression of the pronouncements of the artist, in a dual confusion of the persona of the artist with the individual artist and the individual artist with the artwork. That's the kind of, again, double slippage that you find in Beuys. In particular, what are the mechanisms and the ways by which artworks themselves carry and express particular forms of collectivity? For it is not, in my view, primarily a question of collectivizing the social subject position of the artist that is at stake. I take that to be the Beuys project, collectivizing the social subject position of the artist, which is a kind of 60s Nietzschean libertarian project. It's more a question of the sense in which and the means by which the artwork itself can function as a collective subject, or indeed, or something like a collective subject. That is to say, the manner in which it's able to speak with a collective voice of some sort. And the presupposition, really, that I have here is that all art speaks with a collective voice of some sort. So the question is, in a sense, of what sort? So the artwork, I'm going to suggest, adopts the subject position of a we, not on behalf of any empirical we's, any empirical social groups, but rather as the carrier of the collective historical contents of its artistic materials through its technologies, its techniques, its materialities, and the history of its forms. This is the element of anonymity in the mode of address of the artwork, which matches the anonymity of its addressee, as is always the case, to some extent, semiotically speaking, of all cultural rather than personal practices. In this respect, I want to suggest art articulates the impossible we of modernity, the thing that is impossible in the Hegelian concept of modernity, not as a goal, but as an exemplar of the dynamically contradictory structure of collectivity itself. So what I'm interested in is the contradictory structure of collectivity and the kind of historical determination of collectivity as a kind of dynamic system of social contradictions. Yeah. And the question is, if you like, how does the artwork articulate that, if it does? Okay, well, to address these issues, I think we need to begin with a recognition that the social ontologies of late 19th and early 20th century Europe that grounded in that period the sociological problematics of both liberalism and socialism, and hence also anarchism and communism, should we wish to consider those, if you like, the purified extremes of the former. That is to say, our received late 19th century political spectrum. I take the categories of those social ontologies to be no longer historically actual, although they remain residually, powerfully, historically effective. So, I mean, if you think about your election yesterday and the representation of parties and the way in which newspapers produce kind of spectrums of different possible coalitions, right? They all presume that all political positions can be mapped, right, on this post-French revolutionary left-right position, which can be mapped onto the distinction between collectivism and individualism, right? And I think this doesn't really work anymore.
It's gone.
It's back.
It's back.
We live intellectually in the shadow of these historically redundant social ontologies. and what I want to call the negative space of their mutual limitations, suspended in a transition towards a goal that remains totally obscure and opaque. So this is the crisis of both Enlightenment and classical concepts of politics. And returning from the critique of the Enlightenment to the affirmation of the democratic character of ancient political ideals, which is the main mode of post-Althusserian French political philosophers like Foucault and Rancière in particular, will not solve this problem. It will only function to cover over and hide the depth of its historical contradictions. Okay. So what I want to suggest is we can see something of the structure of the problem, that is to say the structurally contradictory character of the concept of collectivity from the standpoint of the negative space of the mutual limitations of these categories. First, in the way in which they were formed mutually through the relations between modern concepts of individual and collective, basically from the 17th to the 20th century. And second, and this is the bit I'll probably skip because it's a bit technical, but I want to make a couple of points in relation to it. In the more complex linguistic structuralism, or the structural analysis of personal pronouns that you find, and in particular, the structural linguistic deconstruction of Hegel's attempt to identify the I and the we, because certain forms of false collectivism assume the possibility of the identification of the I and the we. Okay, so even though Hegel's project is taken to be defunct at the level of the world historical level, people are still, if you like, thinking of collectives as baby world histories in a way. They're trying to kind of self-enclose themselves in coherent identifications between individualism and collectivism. Okay, so I'm going to say three things, possibly within my 40 minutes, possibly only two. Something about the individual-collective relation, something about the I-we relation in terms of structural linguistics, that's the bit I may skip, and then something about art as the model of the contradictory structure of collectivity and what sense we can make of that idea. Okay, so if we just take these two concepts, or if we look at them in terms of their historical semantics as terms, if we start with the individual, we need to, in a way, defamiliarize ourselves with the concept of the individual. The concept of the individual is historically, in the sense in which it's used to refer to individual human beings, is historically and geopolitically incredibly recent and relatively restricted. So if you look at the history of Europe through the history of European languages, which basically means looking at the history of Latin turning itself into a variety of European vernacular languages in the course of the 18th century, it's worth remembering that there is no equivalent to the modern concept of individual in any ancient European languages. So the Latin word individuum, from which all of the European languages take the word into their own language, does not apply to a person in classical Latin. There is no usage of the term. There is no recorded usage of the application of the term individual to a person. It has a strictly logical and grammatical usage. Similarly, the Latin word persona, which is usually used to trace the modern concept of person through Roman law, and is closely related to the concept of the individual today, I feel like has no such relation and no such level of generality either. So if you look at, medieval Latin grammars, you find that the terms individualis or individuus, they only refer to the indivisibility of something. That's to say, a single case of a species of any kind, right? Logically a species, right? So the use of the term individual to refer specifically to human beings is a post-18th century development, originally associated, as all these developments are, sadly, with Christianity, in this case with English Puritanism is to blame, which emerged as part of a new distinction between the individual and the collective, and that's a new distinction. I want to draw attention to this mainly because the fact that it's a new distinction means that we need to be able to think about the fact that it might go out of existence, that we might be able to think about the human relations and the political relations that we currently think contradictorily in terms of the relation between individual and collective in a different way. That these terms might, that if you like, we found a better way of practicing and of thinking about a practice, we might live in a world in which these terms no longer have any purchase. That's, if you like, the utopian horizon of that kind of historical criticism. Yeah. Okay, so you get that distinction in the 17th century, and by the 19th century it's turned into an antithetical opposition between individualism and collectivism. Whereas today, the primary function of the term individual has become the expression of the idea that every human being in the world is or should be some kind of autonomous entity, and at the same time that each of these human beings is in a certain sense different from all the others, and perhaps they ought to be all different from each other. Okay, this is in a way a kind of paradise of liberalism, kind of dwelling in the semantics of the term individual. As a result, individual and society, for example, are now used misleadingly as opposites. One reason for that, of course, is that society, in a sense, doesn't really exist, because the society position in the antithesis of individual and society is really actually occupied by the nation state. Since what sociologists call societies are primarily constituted through their territorial boundaries by the deployment of violence by states. The individual's incorporation into exchange relations on the one hand, but their continued alienation from state projects means that the modern individual became a universal concept for the single person as a kind of quasi-groupless entity. So what's, if you like, lurking within the concept of the individual is this idea of a groupless entity, which is obviously sociologically and not a possible thing. It's reflected philosophically in its most kind of rationalized idealist form in the modern epistemological subject as what Elias calls a we-less I. And this we-less I, this modern philosophical subject, the we-less I, it kind of disseminates itself through cultural discourse. So if we view the individual-society opposition from the linguistic standpoint of personal pronouns, we see what Elias calls changes in the we-I balance, and unsurprisingly, all societies with a growing predominance of exchange relations as their dominant social relation historically developed the semantic tilting in the we-I balance away from the constitutive function of the concept of the we and your conception of the person to the I as, if you like, the kind of ontological core of the concept of an individual human. And that's how we think of ourselves, right? However, this process of individuation is contradictory because greater individuation accompanies both greater social differentiation and corresponding growth in the scope of social identifications. But in their greater plurality and their social rather than their political character, this growth in identifications which takes place alongside the growing impotence of individuals in relation to political action relative to the growth of units of political integration. So the more individualized developed capitalist societies become, the more value which is given to the individual and the act of the individual's separate freedom the less reality that act has at all in any political sense, because the units of political integration, which have to be structurally transformed politically, become larger and larger, from nation state to region to quasi-global entities. So that's the, if you like, that's the constitutive impotence, if you like, and the growing constitutive impotence of individuality within capitalist societies. So there is no I identity without a we identity, but in this extreme case, the predominant we identity may nonetheless become membership of the group of otherwise groupless I's. That's to say, the group of the groupless is, if you like, the model for the abstract concept of collectivity, which is a little bit like Rancière's part that is apart from the whole rather than a part of the whole. But the commonality of a groupless exclusion from power is not enough to sustain a political subject, let alone a political project. This is the problem with, Rancière's libertarianism. Since its social basis lies in its asociality alone, because it's the asociality which is uniting the groupless into the group of the groupless. A political subject here, or political we, would have to be a political enunciation capable of articulating social interests beyond the grouplessness of those most alienated from those relations. Okay, so what is the concept of the collective? What is its relation to this problem? Unsurprisingly, the term parallels the change in the term individual from a quite independent meaning to a meaning which becomes tied up with the notion of the individual as a single unit. So if we think about the word collect, and this works the same, I think, in English and German, actually, because they've got a common Latin root in this case. The words are more or less identical. If we think of the word collect, which derives from the Latin cum ligare, meaning to tie or to bind, hence to bind together, in other words, a ligature. Okay, that's the origin of the notion of collecting. Collective is the notion of a ligature. So in Latin, it used to refer to a gathering or an assembly bound together by a common purpose. Initially, obviously, primarily religious, right? But this tells us a couple of things. First, it tells us that the grammar of the notion of the collective presupposes separation followed by bringing together. So the concept of the collective is founded on the ground of, if you like, attempting to compensate for the impotence of the concept of individuality. Okay? But the collectivity which aims to compensate for the impotence of individuality is nonetheless, if you like, constituted as a relation between these impotent individualities. Yeah. This is the contradiction. So it's understood as a separation followed by a process of bringing together, which is usually understood spatially, into one place. So you can talk about collections, not just of people in collectives, but obviously of money. You can talk about it scientifically in terms of specimens. You can talk about it art historically before the modern concept of the museum in terms of curiosities. These individual specimens that are beyond scientific classification. And this notion of the curiosity, which precedes the concept of the work of art relative to collecting, actually ends up being, in its individuality, in its, if you like, radical singularity, the model for the so-called autonomous work of art. So people often, if you like, contrast curiosities to works of art, but actually curiosities are the ontological model for the autonomous work of art. In this context, to collect is also to regain control of something, as in collecting your thoughts, for example, or to collect materials for a work, which is a phrase you often find in Ruskin, for example. So we've got two basic senses of gathering together, the literal sense, and figuratively composing and more specifically becoming self-possessed, which is an important phrase politically. Since the personhood of the individual human began to be conceived at the same time as the notion of its individuality through the notion of self-ownership. So you can't really separate out the modern concept of the individual from the concept of the person and the concept of self-possession. In collectives, on the other hand, which I take to be self-gathering collections of human individuals, individuals aim to regain something they shared, including sharing itself, which has been lost to the growing individuality out of which they're made. So this is the structural contradiction of it's presently wet, yes, out of which this is made. Okay. Note that in this respect, collective is a genuinely modern concept. Parts of buildings are about to start flying towards us. In other words, a collective is absolutely not like a community, right? It's not a Gemeinschaft. It's not a quasi-natural social given. A collective is always a social bond produced by a political act. This social bond produced by our pretense that we're not being subjected to extreme climactic conditions. I think maybe I need to move slightly, yes. Collectives have a constitutive dissensus. So collectives aren't based on consensus. Communities are based on kind of enforced normativity and consensus. Collectives are based on dissensus, negotiable dissensus within common projects. That's my sense of collectivity. So they're not held together by values, whatever they are. I'm not really a great believer in values. They're held together by practices, including, of course, art practices. However, this is the Beuysian error. Contra Joseph Beuys, art practices cannot hold societies together. Okay, only certain kind of anthropologically ritualistic societies are held together by art practices. You can't transpose the anthropological model of artistic ritual as community formation from those anthropological contexts into developed capitalist societies, right? That's the kind of anthropological romanticism of the Beuys project. Since that is not the structural role or possibility of art, in capitalist societies, indeed it's not even part of the Western modern concept of art, which survives the critique of its own political impotence and expands its domain globally along with its own parameters. So Beuys's concept of, if you like, expansion, the notion of expanding the concept of art, although it was directed towards, if you like, expanding the concept of art to embrace and exhaust all social relations, thereby turning society into a kind of sort of auto-poetic, artistic act. What's actually happened, like the fate of the expanded concept of art, which has its origins with Beuys in the 60s, is to, if you like, expand the domain of autonomous art within the terms of its impotence, its remaining impotence. And the problem here is that no amount of political will amongst artistic communities or in artistic collectives, which I take to be very different things, can do anything about this structural fact. I take this to be structural. a structural issue. Okay, that's my main point, and I have a long section which I'm going to skip. To achieve a few remarks about art at the end, so we can have some discussion of some sort. Okay. Yeah. So the question is, well, what's the function of the work of art in relation to the contradictory structure of collectivity, which, in the sense that collectivity contains the contradiction between individual and collective within itself. Right? So the collective is the contradiction between individuality and collectivity. It's not one side of it. It's the contradiction itself from the standpoint of one side, from the standpoint of collectivity. And I think there's two basic functions here. The first is that the autonomous work of art, in its obscure and opaque self-possession that it presents as a consequence of its thing-like character, actually achieves the illusion of possessing the ontological characteristics of the self-possessed liberal individual, which doesn't actually exist. Okay? So in other words, the liberal fantasy of individual freedom, which cannot exist, if you like, within the human and in human relations, because it denies the constitutively social character of all individuality, is nonetheless presented and kind of acted out by the autonomous work of art. Right? This is the sense in which, the problematic sense, to put it mildly, in which when someone like Adorno talks about the utopian promise of the work of art as a prefiguration of a free praxis, what he's actually pointing towards is the actualization of the fantasy of the liberal concept of freedom. Right? I mean, this is the limit of Adorno's thought, right? That fundamentally he remains liberal. On the other hand, more interestingly, I think, the work of art relates to this individual collective contradiction, insofar as, by virtue of speaking with a collective voice through its presentation of the history of its materials, it stages the contradiction between individuality and collectivity in a stark form. Because, if you like, the alleged autonomy of the work of art, the aspiration to free or self-determining meaning production that the work itself has within the context of the modern concept of art, sits quite starkly contradictorily beside the collective contents of its historical meaning. And that in those, if you like, individual works of art in their autonomous sense function artistically only via the collective content of their technologies, techniques, materials, and the history of their forms, but that collective content is wrapped up and presented as the self-expression of the individuality of a single work. So, in this sense, the work of art in the modern Western and abiding sense within contemporary art institutions contains the fundamental political contradiction of the relation between individuality and collectivity, which is, if you like, structurally characteristic of capitalist societies. And it presents it, if you like, in something like a pure form. A form that's, if you like, covered over politically by political fantasies of political subjects, which in fact can never achieve the unity required for the concept of the subject. Right? So in some sense there are no functioning political subjects, there's only the subjectivity of political processes, the structural subjectivity of political processes. Okay, I'm going to stop. That's half an hour.
Many thanks, Peter.
Da musst du, probier mal. Dann Stimme, vielleicht.
Okay, reden wir ein bisschen lauter. Many thanks, Peter. Despite these awful conditions, you managed to get your message through in perfect politics of time. Many thanks. I thought there's a lot to discuss. You come sort of with a negative message to us. Not only with rain, but also with a negative message. Which is that not only do collectives not work, but also if we achieve in presenting an autonomous...
I didn't say collectives don't work.
This microphone.
I didn't say collectives don't work. I said they have structural limitations built into the concept of collectivity. And they'll work better if you understand them relate explicitly to those structural contradictions. Because I think there's a tendency for collectives to think they're communities, they're temporary communities.
Yeah. But? They're not.
Please continue.
No. I thought you said they're not, and there's a built-in...
They're not communities,
There's a built-in dissensus, and I got you also...
Yeah, this is their great advantage. They're not communities, right? Because let's say, community for me is a backward-looking, conservative and normatively repressive term. Right? I mean, communities are always constituted through exclusion. Right?
And I understood you saying that the aspiration to an autonomous work of art finally results in something like an ideological mirror of liberal fantasies.
It contains this is the contradiction. It contains the pure form of the liberal fantasy, right? But it contains alongside it more substantively, right, an actual collective historical voice, of like a voicing of the collectivity, the social collectivity, which is condensed into its own artistic materials, right? So it expresses and condenses the social labour that goes into the production of the technologies that it uses.
The question I would like to ask, though, is I announced you as the thinker of contemporary art in difference to modern art.
I'm avoiding talking about that.
However, you use the term work of art or art, transhistorically in a way, at least in your presentation now.
Well, they're meaning the modern Western. The contemporary art is internal to the modern Western concept of art.
Yeah. Well, my question would simply be, if you would agree that in contemporary art we see a process of being reflexive about of these basic contradictions of collectivities. First, second, there is a certain tendency to build artistic collectivities, and third, also when it comes to artistic events or works of art, they tend to expose, as you say, more their being a collective. I think the modernist, modernist montage, for instance, or cut-up piece of several, exposing its history or materiality, still believes in some kind of a unity, and maybe works of art, of contemporary art, rather celebrate the dissensus of materialities, of processes, and of singularity.
Yeah,
and so if there's such a tendency, what could be the political signification of that? That's the question I wanted to ask.
But I want to value the condensed historical collectivity that is built into all artistic materials, right? And which is expressed through the articulation of those materials as art.
How do you define materials here? What do you mean by, can you unpack artistic materials?
Right. Anything which is any element which is put into relation with another element in order to produce an articulated unity of some sort. So technologies, techniques, actual, different physical kinds of materialities in the sense of, the traditional sense, wood, bronze, hair, blood, shit, and also the reservoir of the history of forms which artists inherit from art history, right? So the collectivity for me is condensed into these materials, and one of the functions of the work in its articulation of the elements is to express, if you like, the condensed collectivity of the materials, which is generally, some form of social labour or other. Right? That's being expressed. Artist collectives, which are, if you like, political attempts to get away from the individual character, if you like, from the individuality of works which connects it to ownership, self-ownership, the market, etc. For me, it's the other way around. For me, they're symbolic. They have symbolic functions rather than practical functions, right? I see since the collectivity of the work resides primarily in the history of the materials, I don't want to politically value the collectivity of their production over the deeper social collectivity of their materials.
Could you repeat that?
More inventions, questions.
But doesn't that just mean, so you've got collectivity when looking at the artwork and what it embodies, and there is this sort of inherent collectivity through that artwork, and then, I haven't really followed you with, so then we see a particular artwork which consists of ideas and context, as you say, in a reservoir of forms and materials, and there's this sort of collectivity which goes into its coming into being, and then it moves into some sort of context in which we see that work of art, and then we as viewers contribute also to its collective coming into being by our interpretation of that and all the things that we bring to that. And then how do I put this collectivity into a political form? I'm not quite following you.
The point is you don't, because it's art. That's the problem, right? I think Adorno's right that art is constitutively politically impotent, right? Because which doesn't mean you can't produce political art. It's just that you produce it as a mode of politics rather than a mode of art. And so its art character is an aspect of its political instrumentalization, which is fine, because it's politics, right? But I'm against the idea that, if you like, that politics is in some way enhanced by art, or that art, qua art, is better if you think it's political rather than impotent, right? I think there's just lots of wishful thinking about this, right? You don't get beyond it because that's the structure of the contradiction, right?
No, then how do you get beyond political impotence? How do you get politically potent?
Well, the political impotence here belongs to art, right? You get politically potent by not trying to do politics through art, by doing politics as politics. The idea that so many people now try to do politics only through art is a sign, if you like, of the death of politics.
Today we we celebrate silence. Another question.
I have a very simple question, simple representation. How do you think is it important for the current to integrate the Moscow conceptualism in European art history, especially in terms of collectivity and individuality, because Moscow conceptualism is not so well researched, especially here in Europe.
Kind of is these days, I think, actually, but it wasn't until 20 years ago. Yeah.
Sorry, what is Moscow conceptualism? From Moscow.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I've written about this actually. I mean, Moscow, it's one of those things, you know, I mean, Moscow conceptualism is actually a kind of Western category. Because, you know, Groys's original category was romantic conceptualism. But in order to be, if you like, mapped within the Western art world, it had to be, it had to be fixed. So it had to become Moscow conceptualism, as if you like, rather than having, if you like, independent, distinctive conceptual features, as if it was in some sense the expression deriving from Moscow, right? Because that's what you have to do if you want to narrate it, because of this extraordinary compulsion of traditional art history to only be able to tell a national narrative. Right? It's okay, go on.
So, for example, the form of the artistical reflections, because Moscow conceptualists work different compared to the conceptualist artists here, or like in New York and so on. And so the question is, can we learn today something from the Moscow conceptualism in terms of the artistic practice? Because there were like a lot of groups and they were different in collectives, and
there's one thing you can learn, which is that art tends to be better when it's produced in a context in which there's no market. I mean, if you look at the art coming out of Moscow today, right? It's a bit of a catastrophic collapse, right? For instance, yeah, I mean, that's one lesson.
Yeah, I was wondering if your opposition between community and collective is enough, since I would say that nowadays political struggles go much about the very sense of collectivity. So if you have to
I have a problem with that.
pluralize also the side of collectives and see that instead of, because you stress so much this contradiction of tension between the individual and the collective, and I would say now political struggles go much more in the direction of questioning or proposing different sorts of collectivity, meaning it can be collectivity of interest or affect. You know, a lot of
there are many sorts of collectivity, but they're all structured by the same internal contradictory relation to the notion of the individual, because they have the separation of their members as their premise. Because the collective is a gathering of individuals through a common project, through a common political act. Right?
well, I don't know.
The thing is that when I say something is contradictory, right, that doesn't mean like it's bad and wrong. Right? It's contradictory in the dialectical sense that the reality in which we live cannot be adequately grasped in a way which is logically coherent.
No, but there is a lot of, kind of also questioning this idea if political collectives are only made by humans, for example, and also by things and animals and places and architectures and so on. And
You could go down that line, but that is not, they're not collectives. I mean, that's a kind of post-actor network theory flat ontology, multiplicity, in which the concept of the individual has already gone back to being a purely logical category of indivisibility.
Yeah, but
That's an ontology in which the human and non-human distinction is not to be given any normative force. I don't believe that. I want to maintain a human, non-human distinction.
okay, but that's a political standpoint, and if you go on a level of analysis, then we can at least say, even if this is your standpoint, that this
I think that.
I think this is a more suitable description of what is going on politically, and in a way, this very search for the notion of collective, this questioning if we should only think in terms of humanity or not, or other, I think is also continued in the artistic sphere, where art itself opens up to, you were talking before about what is material art, and also there we see a search for opening up the material to collectives that are humans, and where the work of art is, even its autonomy that you stress so much, is in a way also questioned. So where are the borders of the work of art, and cannot there be, in that sense, also politicality in the very internal questioning of the structure of the art piece that is similar to the questionings that are happening within politics, that you might not agree, but they are in place.
I don't think there is a politics undertaken by non-human entities, independently of their relations to humans. I think I can't make sense of that idea.
Because politics, in your sense, is only activity and talking.
No, it's not it's a collective activity of the production of the social or the transformation of the social. Yeah. I mean, you can talk about the politics of changing human, non-human relations, but talking about it in that way, is politics is always on the human side. Right?
Yeah, but if the human is responding or is connected to others, then it is
But I mean, those kinds of flat ontologies require the dissolution of the concept of the social. Some people want to do this, but I think it's a kind of depressed self-annihilation.
So maybe one more final question, and then we move on to the next presentation. For those of you who wonder why I don't stop this woman, this is my friend Francesca. Presented here in June, Francesca Ramonti, and whom I welcome here as well.
I have a comment. I think that it would be really interesting to apply what you're speaking to the situation in which we are now, but probably for that we would need a longer time, because it's very abstract, I guess, for most of us. And here we are on the invitation of a collective. How many people?
Between 9 and 20, 30.
And then we are here yet another